picture Tokyo for a second. You're probably seeing, like, neon lights reflecting off rain-slick pavement.
Oh, absolutely. The classic visual, right?
Right. You're seeing these towering skyscrapers, glass and steel everywhere. And those massive, crowded pedestrian crossings.
Where everyone is just weaving past each other perfectly.
Exactly. It's a city we almost exclusively define by how it looks. But I want you to close your eyes for a second.
Okay, I like where this is going.
If you listen to a recording of Tokyo from, say, the late 1960s, you aren't going to hear the hum of neon.
No, definitely not.
You're going to hear this chaotic, angry blast of a saxophone just rattling the walls of a cramped basement.
It's a completely different vibe.
It really is. And then if you fast forward a few decades, that saxophone gets replaced by this pristine, algorithmically generated voice of an AI avatar.
Hyperpop beats, yeah.
Right. So today, on this deep dive, we are ignoring the postcards. We are experiencing Tokyo entirely through its sound.
Which is just such a fascinating way to understand a place, honestly.
I think so, too. And our map for this sonic excavation is this really brilliant piece of research.
Yeah, the column published in 2025 by Monumental Movement Records, right? MMR.
That's the one. They mapped out what they call the multi-layered soundscape of Tokyo.
I love that term. Multi-layered soundscape.
Right. And they focus on 4 highly distinct neighborhoods. We're looking at Shinjuku, Shibuya, Shimokizawa, and Akihabara.
And each of these zones acted as a sort of pressure cooker for entirely different musical movements.
Exactly. And to really get to the bottom layer of this, like, geological dig we're doing, we have to start in the rubble and the radicalism of the post-war era.
We have to go to Shinjuku.
Yes. The gritty, narrow back alleys of Shinjuku.
So to understand the sound of Shinjuku in the late 1950s and into the 60s, you really have to understand the psychological state of the youth back then.
Because Japan was rapidly rebuilding, right?
Yeah, exactly. From the devastation of the war, they were throwing up concrete and infrastructure at just this astonishing rate.
The economic miracle.
Right. But underneath that economic miracle, there was, immense social tension, student protests, massive political upheaval.
So where does Shinjuku fit into that?
Well, the youth who were navigating all this chaos, they gathered in Shinjuku because it was this dense, messy labyrinth.
Just cheap bars and narrow alleys.
Exactly. And that specific environment became the incubator for a massive jazz revolution.
I want to pause on that for a second, because when a lot of people hear, jazz revolution,
they picture polite coffee shops.
Right. They picture people politely sipping coffee with a soft piano playing. But that is not what was happening in Shinjuku in spaces like Pit End or DUG or GA.
Oh, not at all. These jazz cafes were intense. They were incredibly cramped, tiny underground rooms.
These are just packed in there.
Packed.
Yeah.
And in that confined space, jazz, specifically this raw, unbridled, improvisational American jazz, it became a vessel for pure frustration.
So it wasn't just background music.
No, the saxophone wasn't just an instrument playing a melody. It was a literal political tool. It was the sound of the city's anger and liberation colliding in real time.
That makes so much sense when you think about the physical reality of the space, actually.
How do you mean?
Well, you're packed shoulder to shoulder in a smoky basement, and someone is just blasting a horn 20 feet away from your face.
Yeah.
It's this physical, sweaty, immediate reaction to the political turmoil happening on the streets just above your head.
That physical proximity was really the defining characteristic because the energy was so concentrated.
Like a pressure cooker.
Exactly. And because of that, different countercultures started bleeding into one another. You had these radical jazz musicians rubbing shoulders with the avant-garde theater crowds.
Oh, right. The theater scene in Shinjuku was huge then.
Massive. Figures like Shuji Terayama and Jiro Kara, they were putting on these rebellious, deeply surreal plays in the same neighborhood.
So you have anti-establishment theater crashing into angry jazz.
Yes, and that collision directly birthed the early Japanese rock scene.
Okay, so who was actually taking that energy and turning it into rock music? Did any of these underground kids start actual bands?
Absolutely, they did. You get bands like Zunu Kisatsu.
Which means, what, Brain Police?
Literally Brain Police, yeah. Which gives you a pretty big hint about their political leanings.
Definitely.
And then you have highly influential groups like RC Succession. By the time they released their landmark album, Single Man, in 1976.
That raw Shinjuku sound was fully established.
Totally established. And 1976 is pivotal for another reason, too. It's the year A live house called Feti opened in Shinjuku.
A live house is basically a dedicated small-scale music venue, right?
Right, exactly. And LFT became the physical anchor for this entire collision of genres. It cemented Shinjuku as Tokyo's ultimate free zone.
It's kind of like, do you think about it? It was like the internet forums or social media of their day.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Yeah, these physical hubs where radical ideas and art went viral in real time. If you've ever felt the need to rebel, Shinjuku in the 60s and 70s was built exactly for you.
It really was. But, eventually the kids who grew up in that tension or the next generation coming up, they wanted an escape.
Right, they were tired of the dirt and the sweat.
Exactly. And by the 1990s, Japan's economy had gone through this massive, unprecedented boom.
So the underground angst gets replaced by pure escapism.
Yes, a desire for escapism and global connection. And that shift physically moved the music scene above ground, which brings us to our second neighborhood.
Shibuya.
Shibuya. The contrast is just night and day.
Because if Shinjuku was the dark basement, Shibuya was the gleaming commercial surface.
Ultra bright. And Shibuya emerged as the epicenter of a massively influential cultural movement known as Shibuya-kai.
Shibuya-kai. And the geographic heart of this wasn't a sweaty club.
No, not at all.
It was a massive retail space, the 7th floor of Tower Records.
Which tells you everything you need to know about the movement, honestly. Shibuya-kai was heavily driven by curation and consumption.
So they were buying up records from all over the world.
Voracious consumers of global culture. Acts like Pizzicato 5 and Cornelius.
What were they listening to?
Everything. From 1960s French pop to Brazilian bossa nova to American soul. They'd absorb all this and then reverse import those sounds back into Japan.
Give me a sense of what that actually sounded like to someone walking down the street in Shibuya at the time.
Okay, think of Pizzicato 5's 1995 album, Made in USA.
Okay.
It sounds like this hyper-stylized, retro-futuristic blend of a 60s lounge act and French pop.
But polished.
Incredibly polished, lost up with this pristine, high-end 1990s studio production. It is aggressive in its optimism.
They didn't just copy Western music then.
No, they meticulously reassembled it into a brand new aesthetic. It became a uniquely Japanese cool that they then exported back out to the rest of the world.
Wait, I'm struggling with this transition a bit.
How so?
Well, we just talked about how Shinjuku was this pure, raw, authentic rebellion against the system.
Right.
If Shibuya is just taking global sounds, polishing them to a meerschaum, and turning them into a product to sell at Tower Records.
Did they sell out?
Yeah. Doesn't that mean the music lost its edge?
So that is the classic critique of Shibuya-kai, for sure. But the MMR column suggests it's a bit too simplistic to view it that way.
Okay, why is that?
It wasn't a loss of edge so much as a total transformation of what the edge meant.
Meaning what?
Rebellion in Shinjuku meant screaming into a microphone. But rebellion in Shibuya meant perfectly mastering the influx of global information.
Ah, I see. Navigating the digital age.
Exactly. And Shibuya wasn't just doing polished daytime pop. As the sun went down, the neighborhood shifted dramatically into a pioneering club culture.
Oh, right. We're talking about those enormous venues like WOMB, Contact, and Vision.
Yes, sprawling, multi-level hubs for house, techno, and hip-hop.
So it's heavily electronic.
Very. And this is where the boundary between the digital and the analog really began to melt.
In those clubs.
Right. Surrounded by lasers and heavy beats, it wasn't about the political struggle of the individual anymore. It was about losing your physical self in the electronic pulse.
The city itself became a machine you could dance to.
Beautifully put, yes.
But, if Shibuya was like stepping into this highly curated, ultra HD movie, that's inevitably going to alienate people.
Oh, absolutely.
Because not every kid in Tokyo in the late 90s wanted to be a slick DJ or a hyper-stylized pop star.
Some people just want to make a mess.
Exactly, which perfectly explains the rise of our third neighborhood. The kids who rejected the commercial gleam of Shibuya, they found a haven in Shimokitazawa.
Affectionately known as Shimokita.
Shimokita. And if Shibuya was the slick corporate tech giant, Shibuya was the scrappy founders tinkering in a garage.
That is a perfect analogy, because as Shibuya grew more corporate, Shimokitazawa became the absolute holy ground for indie music.
And just like Shinjuku, the architecture completely dictated the sound.
It completely dictated it. We're talking about a neighborhood defined by narrow, winding streets, vintage clothing stores, and incredibly small rehearsal studios.
And tiny live houses.
Tiny live houses. Places like Basement Bar and Shelter, they were essentially tiny concrete boxes.
Which fundamentally changes how you play music.
Yeah.
You can't bring a massive synth setup into a concrete box.
Entirely. You couldn't rely on massive acoustics. The architecture literally forced the music to be raw and abrasive.
You just plug in and play.
Right, you played a Fender guitar into an amp, turn the treble all the way up just to cut through the noise of the sweating crowd crammed 2 feet in front of you, and you scream.
So who were the defining voices of this Shimokita sound?
You have legendary guitar bands emerging from this crucible. A perfect example is Number Girl.
Oh, yeah.
Their 2000 album, Sapuke, defined an entire era of Japanese indie rock. It's angular, sharp, intensely energetic.
Who else?
Massively successful bands like Asian Kung Fu Generation and Kuruli, they all cut their teeth in these tiny rooms.
And the overarching philosophy here was just pure DIY.
Pure DIY. They were completely bypassing the massive, shiny record companies that dominated Shibuya.
They didn't need them.
They couldn't use them even if they wanted to. They relied on independent productions, they hand-drew their own zines, booked their own micro tours.
And eventually weaponized early social media, right?
Yes, to build these fiercely loyal fan bases. They built an ecosystem completely independent of the mainstream machine.
It's like if Shibuya was reading a glossy high-fashion magazine, Shimokita was reading a hand-stapled zine where the cheap ink rubs off on your fingers.
It's messy, it's imperfect.
But you know, a real human being made it with their own hands. And that physical, grassroots heartbeat is still alive in those exact same live houses today.
It's a fiercely localized, highly physical music culture. You have to show up in person and feel the vibrations of the amp.
Which brings us to the ultimate contrast.
A total opposite.
Right, because while Shimokitazawa was aggressively holding on to physical reality, our fourth neighborhood was breaking away from physical reality altogether.
Akihabara.
Akihabara. Let's talk about it.
So this is where Tokyo's sound history branches off into an entirely different evolutionary timeline.
How so?
To understand the hyper-futuristic sound of Akihabara, we actually have to look back to the late 1970s and 80s.
Oh, to Yellow Magic Orchestra, right, YMO.
Yes, exactly. The pioneering electronic soundscapes of YMO.
They're legendary. Albums like Solid State Survivor from 1979, which basically laid the groundwork for synth pop globally.
They planted the electronic seed. But what Akihabara did with that seed in the 2000s and 2010s was mutate it into something entirely unprecedented.
Because Akihabara has historically been Tokyo's electric town.
Right. The hub for electronics, computing, and eventually otaku, or geek subculture.
So naturally, the music that incubated there was made of pure data.
It became a melting pot for game music, anime song remixes, Vocaloid, and chiptune.
Okay, wait. For those of us who aren't steeped in electronic music production,
Yeah.
what exactly are we talking about when we say chiptune or Vocaloid?
Sure. So chiptune is music created using the actual programmable sound chips from vintage arcade machines and old consoles.
Like an old Game Boy.
Exactly like a Game Boy. It takes those nostalgic 8-bit beeps and turns them into complex, fast-paced compositions.
Okay, and Vocaloid.
Vocaloid is synthesizer software. But instead of generating a piano sound, it generates human singing.
Wait, really? Yeah. A producer types in lyrics and a melody, and an artificial voice bank, usually represented by a virtual avatar like Hatsune Miku sings the track.
That is wild. So you don't even need a human lead singer anymore.
You don't. Groups like Perfume, with their 2008 album Game, helped bridge the gap between this hyper-digital aesthetic and mainstream pop.
But Akihabara pushed it even further.
Much further. The MMR column conceptualizes the sound of Akihabara as augmented reality sound.
Augmented reality sound. Make sense of this for me. What does that actually look like in practice?
It means Akihabara operates as a future pop laboratory where the music and the technology are entirely fused.
Okay.
We're talking about VTubers, virtual YouTubers using motion capture avatars to perform live streams. We're talking about AI-generated music.
So no physical limits.
None. The artists aren't bound by the stamina of a human drummer or the acoustic dimensions of a tiny live house. The music can be as fast and complex as the software allows.
Which raises a really fascinating question, I think.
What's that? If Akihabara's music is largely virtual, driven by algorithms, and broadcast globally via live streams, is it still Tokyo music?
Ah.
Or has it transcended geography entirely to just become the sound of the internet?
That is the core tension of modern music right there. It has undeniably become the sound of the internet. But it was forged in the specific, dense subculture of that exact neighborhood.
So it still has that Tokyo DNA?
Yes. The aesthetics, The rapid-fire tempo, the blending of anime and gaming culture, it is a geological layer of Tokyo. It just happens to exist half in the digital realm.
Okay, let's step back and look at the map we've drawn here. We have the political, sweaty jazz underground of Shinjuku.
Right.
We have the pristine, globally curated club and pop scene of Shibuya.
Yeah.
We have the fiercely independent, raw guitar rock of Shimokitazawa. And we have the virtual AI-driven pop laboratory of Akihabara.
Historically, they sound like four completely isolated
But
planets.
they aren't anymore, are they?
No, they started that way, but the reality of Tokyo today is that those borders have completely collapsed. The research calls it the era of the multi-layered remix.
Meaning the cross-pollination is constant.
Exactly. You might have a young track maker who grew up dancing in the Shibuya club scene, but they are utilizing the hyper-digital Vocaloid aesthetics of Akihabara.
Or an indie singer in Shimokita borrowing Shinjuku jazz rhythms.
Right. The independent contexts have bled into one massive sonic palette.
And there's this incredibly beautiful concept presented in the research to describe this. It suggests that the city itself operates as a giant sound archive.
It's a profound way to look at urban space. The idea is that the music of the past doesn't just vanish when a trend ends.
Or when a specific club closes down.
Right, it accumulates. The rhythm literally lingers in the walls of the old buildings, in the floorboards of the torn-down clubs, and in the recycled speakers.
Every note played over the last 70 years becomes part of this invisible archive.
That accumulation is precisely what gives any city its unique beat.
Think about how transformative that concept is for you as a listener.
It really changes how you walk through a city.
It does. The next time you walk down a street, whether it's in Tokyo, New York, London, or your own hometown, you aren't just walking past static concrete and glass.
You're walking over history.
You're walking over invisible layers of past rebellions, forgotten basement parties, and garage band dreams. The physical infrastructure molded the sounds, and those sounds shaped the entire culture of the city.
You can't separate the sound of the Fender guitar from the tiny concrete room it was played in.
Exactly. So just to summarize our sonic journey today, we started in the 1950s and 60s, feeling the political fury of jazz vibrating through Shinjuku,
Then we climbed up into the 90s with Shibuya's global pop aesthetic.
blurring the line between flesh and data. Then we took a sharp detour to the sweat-soaked live houses of Shimokitazawa.
For the DIY guitar rock democratization.
And finally, we plugged into the 2000s and beyond, entering the limitless AR-driven virtual soundscape of Akihabara.
It is an incredible evolution. And what's fascinating is that the timeline in the MMR column doesn't stop.
Right, it projects into the current decade.
Noting the massive acceleration of AI music generation and entirely virtual city live shows.
Which brings us to a final, really provocative thought to leave you with.
Let's hear it.
We spent this entire deep dive exploring how the essence of Tokyo's sound history was inextricably shaped by its physical constraints.
The music sounded the way it did because of the walls.
Right. The cramped basements of Shinjuku forced the jazz to be loud. The low-ceilinged live houses of Shimokita forced the guitars to be sharp. The architecture molded the culture.
So what happens when that's gone?
Exactly. If we're moving into an era dominated by AI music and virtual environments, what happens to the sound of a city when the music becomes entirely untethered from reality?
Wow, yeah.
If a virtual club or an AI generator has no physical walls to constrain its sound, no floorboards to absorb the sweat of a crowd, how will the next generation leave its architectural echoes behind?
When the physical constraints disappear, what shapes the sound?
That's the question we'll leave you to mull over. Thanks for joining us on this sonic exploration today. Next time you step outside, keep your ears open. You might just hear the multi-layered history of your own city waiting to be discovered.